All right, well, my name is Jared Kite. I'm the president and lead developer at Odoo, and we are gold partners outside of Seattle, Washington. And today's talk is how US companies can implement payroll in Odoo today. So a little bit about our kind of payroll story or journey. Back in 2016, we implemented the federal rules for ourselves, primarily, where we were getting founded and starting up and everything. And we needed to be able to submit our own payroll and things like that, right? So we implemented it. At Odoo Experience 2017, I gave a talk on payroll. It's still pretty relevant, and I would recommend people check that out as a good introduction to payroll in general. Right now we have approximately 20 states open sourced between versions of 10 and 12, or 10, 11, 12, right? So we have a lot of additional payroll, like modules and hooks and stuff like that. So we can do salary based on attendance, not just like the work 100 schedule stuff, but like actual clock in, clock out attendances. We can do payroll based on timesheets. So that's particularly useful maybe if you have like, any employee could be paid that way for sure, but we've definitely seen that more used in kind of like contracting and stuff like that, where the employee, they're not necessarily an employee as much as they are somebody who's kind of submitting these timesheets or whatever as they do work. This year we made an integration with gamification badges, which is kind of one of our own company's core incentive kind of thing to get promotions out faster and reward behavior that is good for the company in general, right? And we have holidays and leaves integration with both the attendance and timesheet kind of having their own versions of that kind of stuff. And we have a lot of bigger clients now than 2016, right? So we've seen more advanced rules and withholdings and stuff around 401k and shift differential and stuff like that. So the long and the short of it is, if you're a US company and you want to use payroll, if you're in 10 through 12, then you can do that right now. Our stuff is open source on GitLab. And thank you for coming to my talk. No. So in reality, we're going to be spending most of our time today talking about kind of the migration, or in a lot of ways a rewrite of payroll for the United States in version 13 with the new kind of enterprise payroll system stuff. So start off with, let's talk about kind of some simplification to the module structure. Here we are on Odoo 12, and I have filtered to see the state implementations, or in some cases the like base implementations and the accounting stuff. One thing that you have to keep in mind with this stuff is that in general you would install a state, and then you have to go through some customizations and setup. So one of those things that you would need to set up right after installing it would be that you have usually kind of rate specific things coming from that state. So we have something for that. So you'd go into configuration, payroll rates. This is something we did in 2019 during the like payroll rules 2019 kind of implementation stuff. We abstracted a bunch of like year specific rules into these like rate calculations. And in Odoo 13 we have something similar now called the rule inputs or something like that. Rule parameters. And we'll see those in a little bit. So in general, these are kind of the default rates. They don't get updated. These are like starting rates, right? So you're assigned a new rate from the government body, and you'd come in here and put in your new rate, and you'd say when it starts. And you can kind of, if you get a new rate mid-year or whatever, you can swap it out dynamically without needing to mess with the rules. But after installing a state, our accounting kind of hook doesn't have a chance to set up the accounting. So if we come over here, I've added the debit and credit accounts so that we can visualize this. We'll see that we have a bunch of these EE or employee specific withholdings, and we come down here to the California and Georgia and stuff like that, and they don't have any accounts, so that would be something that you need to set up right after installing the module. We might kind of take a little notice here that we kind of implemented some naming conventions during our last kind of rate releases. That includes the EE underscore and wage underscore and ER underscore kind of like naming conventions to simplify both the like legibility of the reporting and stuff, and ultimately to make things easier going forward. So after setting up those kind of accounts and everything like that, you would traditionally go to contracts. So if we go into employees and we load up this user here, we already have a running contract. And so every state has their own structure, and they kind of inherit the rules from the other structures. And so you would say, you know, this is a California employee, you'd fill out your various W-4 kind of information over here, and then you'd go to state filing, where we'd have ultimately little blocks for every state. We tried to keep them in general in order, in alphabetical order, but that didn't always work out. So let's see what we got in Odoo 13. We have simplified the module structure quite a bit by including everything inside of kind of the base implementation of payroll. And then we have our accounting module, which has install hooks that will set up all of the accounting for those rules based on those kind of like prefixes for the rule names for how to assign the accounts. And then you would obviously customize it a little bit. So the other thing we should look at, forms and stuff. So in the key difference here would be that if we go into payroll and we go into an employee here in payroll and look at a contract in the same way that we saw before, we only have one structure, the USA employee. I have other structures, but that's just because the demo data is installed. And when you enable this structure, you get a new field that's required here, which are payroll forms. This is a new model to extract out all these form details away from the contract and into kind of its own model. In fact, it's available also down here as employee forms. And if we bump that up, we'll note that we still have all of our kind of federal details and stuff like that over here. And we have a new applied state here. So if I could type in California and hit return, we'll see the California specific filing kind of details and stuff over here. And ultimately that's for every state. All right, so next, specifically about rules, we should talk about basically the rules as a whole. Salary rules, but that's close enough. So one kind of important aspect of US payroll and probably other payrolls is there's a lot of withholdings that are based on certain wage kind of requirements. So we have rules up here that are designed to like collect up the wage over a period of time, because ultimately up to $7,000 or so for Social Security it's like $100,000 or something, but for FUTA, federal unemployment, it's like $7,000 wage base. So you only pay your percentage up to the first $7,000 or so of that employee's salary for the year. And in general, that was pretty clean, and it makes reporting fairly easy and stuff to be able to see the wages broken out like that. If we look at individual rules, for example, for our FICA Social Security here, you'll note that we get the rate out of that rates object that we saw earlier and apply it to the contract and stuff. But there's an employer portion of this as well. And if we come down to the employer one, we'll see that what it does is it really just copies the value directly over from the employee portion. And that's technically the way it's supposed to be. You're just supposed to like pay exactly the same on both the employer and the employee side. But if we go and look at a payslip, salary computation here, so we see all these wage categories and stuff on here. And these particular rules have a fairly clean kind of look to them, right? They have an amount and they have a rate, and then they have like the total of the kind of multiplication of the two. But we come down to the employer ones that are just copied, and we see kind of somewhat puzzling results, especially from a reporting perspective if you're new to it, because you don't see like the original wage multiplied times negative 6.2 or something. You just see the exact value that it had before. So if we come over into Odoo 13, we will need to run a payroll batch, which should be fine. So we'll name this November. Note that we've got some features here that are not in stock payroll, and we'll get to those in a little bit too. So we can fill in a structure, but they all have default structures and stuff, so we can just hit generate. And we'll get a batch of payslips. And let's go take a look at that administrator's payslip computation now. So this is vastly simplified. the wage rules are gone, right? And ultimately, what we have done instead for code reuse and stuff like that is we share the computation between the employer and the employee as through a function, and we are able to calculate the wage that we're actually basing this calculation on in an easy way that makes it very straightforward to do reporting, where you would just go and look at a payslip line and say, payslip lines and say, you know, this is ultimately the wage that we used for this calculation, and you know, you have to fill that out on the W-2s, right? And we see the same thing down here in the employer portion. It's just basically the wage multiplied times the rate, right? So with all that kind of simplification going on, we also simplified the categories. If we come over and look at this, we'll see that there's a category for FICA Social Security, and there's a FICA Medicare, etc. And the way that we would traditionally do reporting around this would be to go to payslip lines and traditionally group by usually contribution register, but maybe salary category, and we come and we'd see our various categories. So it's actually better to group by contribution register before salary category, because really you're going to remit your 941 through EFTPS, etc., kind of combined, your employer and your employee portion. So we have categories for all these things, and the wage amount up at the top for the employee portion is accurate, but down here it's not so accurate as discussed earlier. So that is simplified, or rather gone, in Odoo 13. What we have, we did expose the payslip lines. That wasn't part of the stock reporting, but we can group by our contribution register category. And now if we note that effectively our contribution registers are partners just like they were before, and if we focus on our FICA one here, we have a employee FICA and an employer FICA, and then a federal tax withholding. And then individually inside of here, if we group one more level down for the rule, we can see that we can extract exactly the same level of reporting that we would have had with the prior setup, but with a much cleaner kind of payslip, right? So while we're on the topic of contribution registers, those are basically the partners or the government bodies that you're going to be paying. So in this case, the most classic example, honestly, is EFTPS, which is the governmental body that you log in and you remit these two forms. And we break them up because that's how it's broken up on the website. So when you go to file for these particular bodies, you're going to file a Form 941, and ultimately that form you're going to have to fill out things like how much wage you paid on and what the rates were, or what the withholdings were for these particular categories inside of here. But when this gets reconciled to your bank account, ultimately those, all of the 941s will hit your bank at the same time. All your 940s will hit your bank at a different time. And so you want to keep those separate. You don't want, even though you're remitting them through the same website, you ultimately do want to keep kind of the payable balances and stuff like that between them. And that leads me to a kind of quality of life improvement. If we go back to our apps and filter for our eBoo payroll again, we have Payroll Payments here, which is an app that's been around since the 2017 talk. In fact, I still get questions on that talk about where the register payment button comes from. And in Odoo 12, that module's responsibility is really that of saying, we'll confirm. And we should have gotten a register payment button. Unfortunately, I must not have installed that particular app. Maybe I'll do that in a little bit, but it's not necessary, because really what we're talking, the core improvements that we've kind of worked on here is that we've vastly simplified the way that the journal entry is created as well. So in Odoo 12 and earlier versions, journal entry was kind of generated per payslip, and ultimately every line was a line from the payslip with an account. Any lines that had accounting consequences would kind of come over here. So you can kind of imagine that if you did have a particular amount hit your bank statement for 941, then if you were going into accounts payable, which is obviously the cleanest and best thing from accounting perspective, to put it into a reconciled account, that bank statement line would ultimately involve clicking a whole bunch of lines to reconcile all together. And it's not impossible. We have people do it. We do it that way because it is the cleanest way to do it. But it does kind of encourage a different accounting mechanism, like making a payroll liabilities account or something to kind of dump all of that stuff into. Well, I can say that our improvements over here are substantial. If we go into payroll batches again, we need to generate the draft entry, which is basically the journal entry. Good time for that Jeopardy music. All right, if we go into any of these payslips and go to the accounting information, we'll see that we've generated an entry. And the most important thing here is that we have generated one entry for the entire batch. So every employee here is represented with their net salary into accounts payable. So we have Abigail, admin, and Mark Demo. But more importantly, from a reconciliation standpoint, we've collapsed up all of that accounts payable for Form 941 into a single line. So now when you go to remit, you don't necessarily need to go into payroll reporting to know what you need to remit. You never really did. You could always go to like a ledger if you were doing accounts payable. But this exact amount is ultimately going to be what lands on your bank statement, and you'll have a single line to reconcile to, which makes it very easy to reconcile, right? Check in on my little list. All right, so I mentioned earlier that the registering payment button, which I unfortunately didn't install here, we'll have to use our imagination, but we would, well, it would be here, right? There'd be a register payment button. You'd press it. You'd get a similar experience to what you would get on an invoice, where you'd have the payment screen come up. You'd pick a payment journal. You'd pick a payment amount, or not amount usually, because it would just get the payable for the net for the employee effectively. But the downside to that is that if you, well, two reasons. Number one, if you want to register payments like that, you're going to have to register a payment for every single payslip all on their own, which isn't necessarily super time consuming, but it is more time consuming than what most people are looking for. And secondly, most people pay their payroll through a standard payroll journal or something like that. In fact, a lot of times that's a separate bank account for either direct deposit reasons or just like managerial reasons. So in Odoo 13, our payroll payments module adds some fields to the journal. So we have our payroll journal here, which is ultimately the journal that the payroll entries are generated into. And on the advanced setting here, we have payroll payments kind of specific configuration for it. Number one, here's our new payroll entry grouping mechanisms and stuff. If you want the original one that Odoo does, you can use it. And if you want one that's a single entry per pay slip, you can do that too, and it'll still have the same grouping for the Form 941 and stuff like that as before. But the real magic down here is the kind of setup for how you're actually going to pay your payroll. So we get to pick a bank just as if we were on a big payment pop-up, right? A payment method like check or manual or whatever, and a refund method for doing refund pay slips. So with that set up, we can go back over to our payroll batch. And we'll note that we have a new register payment button up here, right? When we press it, we are not redirected to a single payslip. We are in fact redirected over to a batch, a single payment. We're in fact redirected over to a payment batch, a batch payment, right? So this would be the place where you would go to hook onto to generate your CSV file or whatever to send to your bank to do direct deposit and stuff like that, which is something that we've done in Odoo 12, but it requires things like server actions with the IDs of the journals and stuff you want to pay out of, and then you kind of group them all together, right? So that's much improved as well. So with all of that out of the way, we can kind of talk about some of the other features, right, that we have. So if we jump back out to our filtered apps for Odoo Payroll, you'll note that we have a commissions payslip module over here, and a payroll gamification. The payroll gamification is something that we did that I mentioned earlier that's for kind of offering like point-in-time salary bumps or like raises, and kind of reduces the need to have like yearly reviews. And then obviously commissions payment, which hooks into the new Odoo commissions app to ultimately pay those commissions back to the employees. And in fact, if we go over to our payslip batch that we already generated, let me take a look here at, say, Mark. Mark should have had more commissions, but that's okay. So he has some commissions and he has some badges, and ultimately those are part of the integration that we're offering. And if we come over to the payslip calculation, those are all basic wage and part of the overall US localization for payroll now. In fact, if we look at the journal entry that was generated, we should see some commissions payable, kind of reducing the liability of your commissions payable for the various employees that were paid on this particular thing. So we're committed pretty heavily to payroll. I did mention earlier that we're planning on having all of the states built into the same app, and we are trying to do that. We have some people that are doing a lot of research and documentation and stuff like that on payroll, and we have already written and collected all the state documentation stuff, and we're just now implementing effectively the different states. So with that kind of out of the way, I'll open the floor to questions.
Any questions?
I'm not sure it's on.
The payroll is one of the crucial processes in HR.
Yes.
That's why I want to know if this process is integrated with compensation and benefit process or not. It's only about the payroll calculation. The company process is you have this structure for every individual, okay, and the benefits are going to be is implemented for as per his level and his title.
Sorry, I'm not sure that I quite understand. So, I mean, every employee ultimately has a contract, and you have different, things on that contract, 401k withholdings or percentages and stuff like that. Am I on the right track?
To make it more clear.
Okay.
It's two separate processes in HR. Compensation and benefits, it's the structure of the benefits of employees based on their levels, based on their goals. It's like a matrix of the benefits. And the payroll is only about the payroll calculation and the local, the income tax, if you want to apply it as per the country laws. This is different thing. I'm asking about the integration for both the metrics of compensation benefit and the payroll calculation.
So, I mean, in general, all of the different calculations for benefits and stuff like that usually have some kind of payroll effect. So, we saw commissions on one earlier, right? So that's a form of compensation. I'm sorry?
Bonus.
Correct. Although commission in the United States is not usually considered a bonus as much as. Yeah, exactly, right, yeah. It's fully taxable wage, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not supplemental wage at a lower rate or something like that. So yeah, I mean, ultimately, the idea is to have as many rules as is necessary. In fact, we can go and look at salary rules. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question right, to be honest, but we're just going to keep going forward, right? So we have a rule here for commissions, and ultimately this rule is very very simple. Actually, I skipped over some of the things I was going to show.
I'm asking this to ensure that everyone is paid what he's entitled to be paid. It's not only about the attendance, it's also about his performance. His performance is analytical bonuses. It could be at the end of the year. It's not about the monthly wages only. There's another elements in the payroll calculation. How can I find it reflected here?
Ensuring that they received the basic salary they were entitled to, kind of a thing. Well, so I mean, we have a variety of reporting. Payslip line reporting is really where we drive pretty much everything, because we can kind of group by rules and group by employees and stuff like that. So we could group by employee and group by rule and stuff. But it'd be hard pressed for me to be able to say whether or not that basic salary actually represents them. That said, when we do implementations, we usually have company-specific rules and fields and things like that. And usually, we have unit tests and stuff around that, right? So we test the same way that we test all of these rules, right? We have a bunch of programmatic creating of of payroll entries and making sure that the categories match the expected amounts and stuff. And we do the same thing for employer-specific like localizations or whatever you want to call that, right? So we'll test to make sure that the amounts that they're getting for their dental or whatever is there on the entry.
You talked a little bit about 401k or simple IRA retirement plan. Are you able to handle the employee matching part of that as well?
Yes, we are.
Based on percentage?
Yeah, so we've done that before with other clients as kind of like those specifically tested rules and stuff for those clients and stuff, and ultimately we'll be making like basic implementations of those same fields and same rules and stuff in the U.S. localization, because ultimately those withholdings have very recognized rules in terms of like the W-2 and EW-2 and stuff like that. So we'll be making as many of those as make sense. We can't implement literally everything though, but we'll implement what we can. All right, thank you.